The rule was simple. Dinner had to be on the table in 20 minutes or the beans would scorch and the gravy would skin. In a 3-room shotgun house in Mingo County, West Virginia, Vera Justice kept a dented aluminum Dutch oven on the back burner every afternoon at 3:45. It was 1972. She fed her husband and 4 children on $14 a week from the company store. Number 6 costs less than a dime a serving. Number 14 was invented by women who could not stand long enough to cook 2 dishes. Number 22 is the reason your grandmother saved every scrap of bacon grease in a tin by the stove. These 25 quick recipes were the working dinner of a whole region. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 quick recipes poor hillbilly families ate in the 1970s. Number 25, soup beans and cornbread. Vera Justice set a pot of pinto beans to soak at 5 in the morning before she walked her oldest to the school bus. By 3 in the afternoon, the beans were soft. The broth was thick, and a hunk of fatback had melted down into the pot. The cornbread went into the skillet at 3:50. It baked while she set the table. You could feed 6 people for under $1. The beans were 29 cents a pound at the company store. The cornmeal was 40 cents for a 5-pound sack. The only rule was that the bread had to be hot enough to melt butter when it hit the plate. Women in coal camps from Logan County to Harlan County made this same meal on the same schedule because their husbands came home on the same whistle. It was not a peasant dish. It was a working dinner that honored a working man. That mattered. Number 24, fried bologna sandwich. In Mingo County, bologna was called poor man's steak, and nobody said it with shame. A thick slice hit a hot cast-iron skillet, the edges curled up into a bowl, and within 90 seconds, it was done. You slapped it between 2 slices of soft white bread with a smear of yellow mustard. That was the whole recipe. Children carried these to the elementary school in Matawan wrapped in wax paper. Coal miners carried them down into the shaft in metal buckets. The bologna was 69 cents a pound at Piggly Wiggly in 1973. A loaf of bread was 35 cents. A family of 6 could eat for under $2. The sandwich was simple, it was hot, and it was on the table before your husband finished washing the coal dust out of the sink. Nobody called it cheap. They called it supper. Number 23, sawmill gravy and biscuits. The name came from the logging camps, where cooks stretched 1 pound of sausage across 40 hungry men by thickening the drippings with flour and milk until the gravy looked like wet cement. In a hillbilly kitchen in 1971, you did the same thing with a 1/4 pound of sausage, 3 tablespoons of flour, and 2 cups of whole milk. The biscuits went in the oven first. By the time they came out golden, the gravy was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. You split the biscuits open, ladled the gravy over the top, and ate it with a fork because a spoon could not keep up. Families in Boone County, West Virginia, made this for breakfast, for dinner, and sometimes for both when the paycheck ran thin. It was powerful fuel for a powerful day. Your grandmother did not call it comfort food. She called it what was on the stove. Number 22, skillet cornbread with buttermilk. Every hillbilly kitchen in West Virginia, Kentucky, and East Tennessee had the same ritual. A black cast-iron skillet lived on the middle rack of the oven. You preheated it with a spoonful of bacon grease inside. When the grease popped and smoked, you poured the cornmeal batter in and listened for the sizzle. The bread baked in 22 minutes flat. The bottom came out crisp and dark, the top was golden, and the edges pulled away from the skillet clean. You crumbled it into a glass of cold buttermilk and ate it with an iced teaspoon. A miner's wife in Letcher County could make this in 15 minutes between the time the children came home from school and the time the whistle blew. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal fed a family for 10 days. The buttermilk came from the grocery in a paper carton, 29 cents a quart. It was simple, cheap, and transformed a handful of meal into a meal. Number 21, fried taters and onions. The potatoes were left over from last night's supper, cold and already peeled, sitting in a bowl on the back of the stove. You sliced them thin, threw them into a cast-iron skillet with a yellow onion and a spoonful of bacon grease, and let them crisp up while the coffee perked. 12 minutes, start to finish. Hillbilly families in Wise County, Virginia, ate this for breakfast, for lunch, and sometimes as the whole supper when payday was still 3 days out. Potatoes were a nickel a pound at the Greenbrier Valley Piggly Wiggly. An onion was 2 cents. A pan of fried taters and onions fed 4 children and 2 adults for under 20 cents. There was nothing beautiful about it on the plate, but it smelled like a coal camp Saturday morning, and it was hot, and it filled you up until the mine whistle blew at noon. Number 20. Wilted lettuce with bacon grease. In the spring, when the leaf lettuce in the garden was tender and the coal camp commissary had not yet stocked the tomatoes, a hillbilly woman would tear a bowl of lettuce, slice a green onion over it, and pour hot bacon grease straight from the skillet across the top. The lettuce collapsed in 3 seconds. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in next, then a crack of black pepper. You ate it while it was still warm. That was it. Women in Pike County, Kentucky, served this beside a pot of soup beans and a wedge of cornbread. It took 90 seconds to make. The lettuce came from a garden that cost nothing. The bacon grease came from the tin by the stove. It was the first green thing the family had tasted in 4 months, and it tasted like a promise that the hard part of winter was over. Number 19. Pinto beans with fatback. The beans soaked overnight in a chipped enamel pot. The fatback, a white slab of salt pork streaked with pink, went in at sunrise with a diced onion and a quart of water. You set the burner to low and walked away. By 4 in the afternoon, the kitchen smelled like smoke and simmered beans, and the pot liquor at the bottom was thick enough to sop up with a biscuit. A pound of pintos cost 29 cents in 1974. A quarter pound of fatback cost 15 cents. The meal fed 5 people for under 50 cents a day. In Buchanan County, Virginia, women made this on Mondays because it lasted 3 days and the flavor deepened each time it was reheated. It was cheap, it was simple, and it held a working family together across a week. Number 18. Fried apples. When the apple tree behind the house dropped its fruit in September, a hillbilly mother in Letcher County, Kentucky, carried a bushel basket to the porch and kept 1 handful at a time in her apron pocket. She sliced the apples into a skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, a handful of brown sugar, and a shake of cinnamon. 10 minutes. That was it. The apples softened, caramelized, and turned the color of a wood stove at dusk. You ate them beside a slab of country ham or spooned them over hot biscuits. The apples cost nothing. The sugar was 18 cents a pound. 1 skillet fed a whole family. Your grandmother ate fried apples the way a New York banker ate dessert, and she did not need anyone to call it special. She called it Tuesday. Number 17. Jiffy Cornmeal Mush. Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix cost 9 cents a box at the Williamson A&P in 1972. But hillbilly women did not always bake the muffins. They stirred the mix into a pot of boiling salted water, let it thicken for 5 minutes, and poured the hot mush into a loaf pan to set. The next morning, you sliced the firm mush into half-inch slabs, fried them in bacon grease until the outside was crisp and gold, and served them with sorghum syrup or a pat of butter. Breakfast cost under a dime per person. Women in Mingo County fed their children this before the school bus came, and the meal stuck to a coal miner's ribs until lunch. 1 box made 8 servings. A bottle of sorghum molasses was 65 cents and lasted a month. Nothing about it was fancy. Everything about it worked. Number 16. Cat head biscuits. These were called cat head biscuits because they were the size of a cat's head, big and soft and pulled apart with 2 hands. In a coal camp kitchen in McDowell County, West Virginia, a woman named Mavis Blevins made 6 of them every morning before 5 when her husband left for the Pocahontas mine. 2 cups of self-rising flour, 1/3 of a cup of lard, 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk. She patted the dough out on a board dusted with flour, pinched off 6 equal chunks, pressed them flat with her palm, and slid them into a hot oven. 15 minutes later, they came out tall, golden, and shaped by a woman's hand instead of a biscuit cutter. Her husband took 2 in his lunch bucket every day for 19 years. She never once missed a morning. Now here is the part that most people miss about a coal camp kitchen. These biscuits were never only about breakfast. They were how a working wife told her working husband that she was still there, still awake at 4:30, still paying attention, even when the wage slip from the mine was thin and the company's store ledger was thick. In Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties, a cathead biscuit was a love letter baked in a skillet. The flour was 39 cents for a 5-pound sack. The lard was $4 for a 3-pound tub that lasted 6 weeks. The buttermilk was 29 cents a quart. A breakfast that cost less than a dime said something no greeting card could say. And that is why, when the children grew up and moved to Columbus or Cincinnati for the auto plant jobs, the first thing they asked their mothers to mail them was a cathead biscuit wrapped in wax paper and cold by the time it arrived. Number 15, ramp and potato hash. In April, when the ramps came up in the hollows of Randolph County, West Virginia, a hillbilly cook would walk the ridge with a burlap sack and come home with a pound of green leaves and white bulbs that smelled like onion and garlic hit with a hammer. She diced the ramps fine, tossed them into a skillet with cubed potatoes and a spoonful of bacon grease, and cooked the whole pan for 11 minutes. You could smell it from 3 houses down. Ramp and potato hash was a free meal because the ramps cost nothing and the potatoes were a nickel a pound. It was the taste of spring in a coal camp, and for many families it was the first hot green meal after a long winter of dried beans and canned tomatoes. Number 14, fried fatback. This is the cheapest meat a hillbilly family ever ate. A pound of fatback, which is pure pork fat with a strip of salt-cured rind, cost 22 cents in 1973. You sliced it thin, laid the strips in a cold cast-iron skillet, and let them render slow over low heat. 10 minutes later, the fat was gone into the pan and the strips were curled, crisp and salty enough to season an entire plate of beans. Families in Mingo and Logan counties ate fried fatback beside a wedge of cornbread and a glass of buttermilk. The leftover grease in the skillet became the cooking fat for the next 3 meals. A 1/4 pound of fatback could flavor a whole week of soup beans. Here is the thing that surprised me when I first read the oral histories. The speed of these recipes was not an accident. It was survival logistics. In the Mingo and Logan County mines in 1972, shift change at Williamson and Island Creek happened at 4:15 in the afternoon. A man had 35 minutes to walk home, wash off the coal dust at the back porch sink, sit down at the table, and eat enough calories to sleep through until the 5 in the morning whistle. If the food was not hot, on the table, and calorie-dense inside that window, he ate cold, he slept hungry, or the children got less so that the miner got more. That is why every one of these recipes runs under 25 minutes. That is why the skillet stayed on the back burner all afternoon. That is why the biscuits went in at 3:45 sharp. The women in these kitchens were not slow cooks romanticizing a rustic life. They were shift workers running a household on a mine whistle. A wife in Logan County, West Virginia, timed her entire day against a steam whistle 1.5 miles away. A second shift meant a second supper at midnight. A third shift meant breakfast at 4 in the morning. The recipes were quick because the husband's life, the children's homework, the second job the oldest daughter worked at Kroger, and the sleep every one of them needed depended on a 20-minute window that closed hard. That is the part most food writers miss. Number 13, fried green tomatoes. In August, when the tomato vines in a backyard garden in Wise County, Virginia, dropped more fruit than a family could can, the green ones came off first. You sliced them a 1/4 inch thick, dredged them in cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried them in bacon grease for 4 minutes aside. The outside was crunchy, the inside was tart, and a stack of 6 slices alongside a plate of soup beans made a dinner that felt like a celebration. A bushel of green tomatoes from your own garden cost nothing. The cornmeal was 4 cents per serving. It was the kind of meal that showed up on a kitchen table in the same week a coal company announced a layoff and nobody felt poor eating it. Number 12, kilt lettuce. Kilt lettuce is wilted lettuce's rougher cousin. It uses leaf lettuce, green onions, bacon, and a dressing made from hot bacon grease, vinegar, and a spoonful of sugar. The difference is the bacon. In kilt lettuce, you chop up 3 strips of crisp bacon and throw them on top. In a trailer home on Pigeon Creek, Mingo County, a woman named Nell Chafin made this on Saturday afternoons when her grandchildren came down from the hollow. It took 6 minutes. It was cheap, It was fast, and it was the only salad most hillbilly children ever tasted. The word kilt means killed in mountain speech. The lettuce was killed by the heat. That was the joke and the recipe, all in one word. Number 11, chicken fried steak. The cut was cube steak, a thin piece of tough round that had been run through a mechanical tenderizer at the Piggly Wiggly in Logan. It cost 89 cents a pound in 1974. You dredged it in flour, fried it in bacon grease for 3 minutes aside, and served it with a pan gravy made from the drippings and a cup of milk. The whole dinner was on the table in 18 minutes. In a coal camp kitchen, chicken fried steak was the Friday payday meal, the one that said the paycheck cashed, the company store bill was paid, and there was enough left over to fry something that used to be beef. A family of 6 could eat for under $2.50. Your grandmother served it beside mashed potatoes and a plate of biscuits. Nobody said it was poor food. They said it was steak. Number 10. Appalachian stack cake. This is the quickest version, the weeknight one, not the wedding one. A hillbilly mother in Breathitt County, Kentucky, would stir together flour, sorghum molasses, buttermilk, and a little soda, roll out 6 thin layers, and bake them 2 at a time in a cast-iron skillet. Each layer took 4 minutes. Between the layers, she spread cooked apples sweetened with brown sugar. The whole cake went together in under 40 minutes, which was longer than most of these recipes but short enough for a Sunday afternoon. The ingredients cost around 85 cents. The cake fed a family of 8 with slices left over for breakfast. It was the kind of dessert that said the month's bills were behind her and the next week was still ahead. Number 9. Liver mush and eggs. Liver mush is a North Carolina mountain staple made from pork liver, cornmeal, and sage. At the IGA in Bristol, Tennessee, a 1-pound slab wrapped in white butcher paper cost 59 cents in 1973. You sliced it a half-inch thick, fried it in bacon grease until the outside was crisp, and cracked 2 eggs into the pan beside it. Breakfast was ready in 7 minutes. For a hillbilly family in Avery County, North Carolina, liver mush was the iron, the protein, and the flavor that carried the father through a morning of cutting pulpwood. The meal cost under 20 cents per plate. It was simple, powerful, and nobody apologized for what was on the label. That was not peasant food. That was Appalachian breakfast. Number 8. Fried cornbread hoe cakes. Hoe cakes are cornbread's fast cousin. 2 cups of cornmeal, a teaspoon of salt, enough boiling water to make a thick batter, and a hot skillet with bacon grease. You dropped the batter in by the ladleful, pressed each one flat with a spatula, and fried them 3 minutes aside. The name comes from the story that field hands in the 19th century cooked them on the blade of a hoe over a fire. In a coal camp in Harlan County, Kentucky, a woman could make 12 hoe cakes in 11 minutes. Served with pinto beans and a green onion, the meal fed 6 people. The cornmeal cost 8 cents per plate. Here is the part that surprised me when I read the oral histories. The reason these recipes disappeared is not that they stopped tasting good. It is that the economics around them collapsed. Consider what $14 a week at the company store actually bought in Mingo County in 1972. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal for 40 cents. A pound of pintos for 29 cents. A pound of fatback for 22 cents. A dozen eggs for 69 cents. A quart of buttermilk for 29 cents. A tin of lard for $4 that lasted 6 weeks. That was the whole pantry, and it fed 6 people for a week with change for coffee. But the company store worked on scrip, not cash. A miner's paycheck had deductions for rent on the company house, for the company doctor, and for the month's grocery charge from the commissary. The markup at the company store was between 15 and 30% over a free market Kroger 20 miles away, but most coal camp families did not own a car. So the $14 bought about $10 of food at real-world prices. A miner's wife in Logan County stretched that the way a blacksmith stretches iron. What most people miss is that this was not peasant cooking. It was applied economics. Number 7. Red-eye gravy and country ham. The country ham slice came out of the smokehouse, salty enough to make your eyes water. You fried it in a dry skillet for 3 minutes aside, lifted the ham onto a plate, and poured a splash of hot black coffee straight into the hot pan. The coffee loosened the ham drippings and turned them into a thin, mahogany-colored gravy the miners called red-eye, because it looked like a tired eye staring back at you from the plate. In a shotgun house in Mingo County, this was served over hot biscuits or a pile of grits. 12 minutes, start to finish. The ham was a Christmas gift from a cousin in Grundy. The coffee was free from the percolator on the back of the stove. Nothing about the meal said poor. Everything about it said home. Number 6, streakoline with brown beans. Streakoline is fatback with a thin ribbon of meat through it, which made it slightly fancier than plain fatback and still cost under 40 cents a pound at the Logan YGA. A family in Pike County, Kentucky, would fry a quarter pound until crisp, then pour the whole skillet, grease and all, into a pot of simmering brown beans. The fat melted in, the crisp pieces softened, and the beans took on a smoky, salty flavor that turned a plain pot into a special one. The meal cost under 90 cents for 6 people. That works out to less than a dime a serving. It is one of the cheapest hot suppers that ever sat on an American table, and it tasted better than some meals that cost 10 times as much. Number 5, cracklin' cornbread. When you rendered a pound of fatback, the pieces that stayed behind in the skillet, crisp and brown and crunchy, were the cracklins. A hillbilly cook in East Tennessee would crumble those cracklins into a bowl of cornbread batter before it went in the oven. The bread baked up golden with crisp, salty pockets of pork fat throughout. You split a wedge, slathered it with butter, and ate it beside a bowl of soup beans. The cracklins cost nothing. They were the byproduct of a recipe you had already cooked. In a coal camp kitchen, nothing was ever wasted, and cracklin' cornbread was the proof. A single pan fed 8 people for pennies. It was cheap, it was powerful, and it was one of the richest things a poor family ever baked. Number 4, shuck beans, or leather britches. These were green beans dried on a string hung from a rafter in a summer kitchen in Buchanan County, Virginia. By January, the beans looked like leather bootlaces, which is where the name came from. A hillbilly woman would drop a handful into a pot of water with a piece of fatback, simmer them for 40 minutes, and have a winter dinner that cost nothing because the beans had been grown and dried the previous August. The taste was earthy, concentrated, and nothing like a fresh green bean. It was a taste that children raised in the hollows knew, and children raised in the suburbs never learned. In 1972, a pint of shuck beans in a mason jar was worth more than a pint of canned beans from the company store because it was free, it was local, and it was proof that your family had planned ahead. Number 3, tomato gravy over biscuits. At the end of August, when the last ripe tomatoes from the garden were too soft to slice, a hillbilly woman would core them, run them through a hand-cranked food mill, and simmer the pulp with bacon grease, flour, salt, and a crack of black pepper. 15 minutes on the stove and the gravy was thick, smoky, and the color of a sunset over Pine Mountain. You poured it over hot biscuits and ate it with a fork. Women in Perry County, Kentucky made this for weeknight supper when the meat in the freezer was running low. It cost under 30 cents for 6 plates. It was hot, it was hearty, and it was the kind of meal that proved a garden and a skillet could stand in for a butcher and a grocery bill. Number 2, poke salad with scrambled eggs. Poke salad is the young leaves of pokeweed, which are toxic if prepared wrong and delicious if prepared right. A hillbilly grandmother in Knott County, Kentucky, knew to parboil the leaves twice, dump the water, and fry the third batch in bacon grease with 3 beaten eggs. The result was a greens and eggs scramble that tasted like spinach with a metallic mineral depth. The poke came free from the fence line behind the house. The eggs came from the 6 hens in the chicken coop. The meal cost nothing except the bacon grease, and it was the first wild green most Appalachian children tasted every spring. By the way, when the mines started closing in the late 1970s and the young people moved north to the Ford plant in Cincinnati or the GM plant in Dayton, poke salad was one of the first recipes their children refused to learn. It looked strange on a suburban plate. It came from a fence line instead of a grocery aisle. It was part of why this whole style of cooking disappeared. Number 1, Fried mush with sorghum. A hillbilly breakfast in 1972 often started the night before. A mother in Mingo County stirred yellow cornmeal into a pot of boiling salted water, cooked it down to a thick mush, and poured it into a bread pan to set overnight in the window. The next morning, she turned the cold loaf out onto a cutting board, sliced it into half-inch slabs, and fried them in bacon grease until the outside was crisp and the inside was soft and creamy. She poured sorghum molasses over the top, slid the plate in front of her husband at 5 in the morning, and watched him eat it before he walked to the mine gate. The whole breakfast cost 7 cents per plate. The sorghum came from a jug a cousin in Hinman had traded for a chicken. Here is the thing most people miss about fried mush. It is the single cheapest hot breakfast a working American has ever eaten. It fed coal miners in West Virginia, tobacco farmers in Kentucky, and pulpwood cutters in North Carolina. And it was on every one of their tables because the women who cooked it knew that a cold breakfast is a slow shift, and a slow shift is a short paycheck. That was not sentiment. That was math. Number 1 stayed number 1 for a reason. A pound of cornmeal, a quart of water, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of grease, and a pour of sorghum. 20 minutes from pot to plate. 7 cents per serving. It was the working dinner's working breakfast, and it held a whole region together for a decade. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride. A way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Venison backstrap with wild mushroom gravy was Christmas luxury harvested from November hunts and preserved for holiday feast. The backstrap was the tenderest deer cut, saved specifically for Christmas when families wanted something special. Hunters took their best bucks in late fall, field-dressed properly, and hung meat in cold sheds where December temperatures kept it fresh. The backstrap was sliced thick, seasoned with salt and pepper, then seared quickly in hot cast iron to keep inside pink and tender. Wild mushrooms gathered in fall and dried were reconstituted and cooked into rich gravy using pan drippings, creating earthy depth complementing venison. In mountain communities, venison Christmas meant rifle skill, understanding deer movement, and respect for animals giving lives to feed families. This wasn't bought meat, but earned through cold mornings in tree stands. The backstrap melted on tongue, flavor clean and sweet. Families served it with potatoes and beans. Soaking beans with baking soda was a trick that solved 2 problems at once in mountain kitchens where fuel was precious and time was always scarce for busy families. A pinch of baking soda added to soaking water softened dried beans faster by breaking down their tough outer skins, reducing cooking time by hours. For families burning wood, they had chopped themselves. Shorter cooking times meant real savings in labor and resources. The alkaline water also neutralized compounds that caused digestive discomfort, making beans easier on stomachs. Women learned exact amounts through trial and error, knowing too much soda left a soapy taste while too little made no difference. The beans soaked overnight in crocks near the warm stove, absorbing water and releasing starches. By morning, they were plump and ready, cooking to creamy softness in half the usual time. This knowledge passed quietly between neighbors as practical wisdom that made survival easier. Soaking wild game in buttermilk overnight was the hunter's trick that every mountain family knew and most modern cooks have never heard of. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, anything that came out of the woods with that sharp, iron-heavy flavor got dropped into a bowl of buttermilk and left in the cold overnight or sometimes 2 full days. The lactic acid broke down the tough muscle fibers gently without turning the meat to mush the way vinegar sometimes did, and the calcium triggered enzymes that softened the protein from the inside. What came out the next morning was tender, mild, and ready to flour and fry without any gamey bite. The old women never talked about enzymes. They said the buttermilk pulled the wild out of it, and that was explanation enough. You rinsed it, patted it dry, and seasoned it. Nobody at the table ever knew it had been running through the hollow 2 days before. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor man's steak, but no one eating them ever complained because they hit every craving just right. Thick pink slices of bologna slapped down on a hot iron skillet and sizzled until the edges curled like little cups, blistering enough to draw out that smoky, salty bite everyone loved. The smell alone could make an empty kitchen feel full. Add a swipe of yellow mustard, a slice of onion, and 2 soft pieces of white bread, and you had a meal that worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was cheap, fast, and always satisfying. Kids carried them in brown paper bags to school, and grown men packed them for long days in fields, mines, or mills. In the hills, fried bologna sandwiches were as dependable as sunrise. Simple proof that flavor never depended on price. The grease soaked through napkins, but no one minded. It was comfort food at its best. When money was thin, this sandwich filled both belly and spirit, turning hard times into something a little easier to swallow. It was fried, humble, and proud, a true taste of mountain living that never needed dressing up to feel right. Pickled pig's feet were Christmas delicacy, transforming butchering scraps into something prized. When families butchered hogs in December, nothing was wasted, especially feet becoming treats after preparation. The feet were cleaned meticulously, boiled tender with bay leaves and peppercorns, then packed into stone crocks and covered with spiced vinegar heated with garlic and pepper. They cured for weeks, vinegar penetrating meat and softening cartilage until everything became tender and tangy. Served cold on Christmas morning, pickled feet were eaten with fingers, meat falling off bones while gelatinous texture melted on tongues. In rural communities throughout the South, these represented thrift elevated to tradition, using every part of hog and creating something delicious. Children learned to appreciate pickled feet as treats, not scraps. The vinegary tang cut through rich holiday meals. This proved mountain cooking was about transforming everything into something worth celebrating. Using vinegar to tenderize meat was how mountain families transformed tough cuts into something approaching luxury without spending money they did not have available. A few splashes of apple cider vinegar added to the marinade broke down tough muscle fibers in wild game and older livestock that would otherwise require hours of cooking. Families made their own vinegar from apple scraps, so the ingredient cost nothing beyond initial effort. The acid worked slowly overnight, penetrating deep into meat while adding subtle tanginess that complemented strong flavors of venison, squirrel, and tough old roosters. Women learned exact proportions through generations of practice, knowing how much was enough to tenderize without making meat mushy. The marinated meat could then be fried, roasted, or stewed with significantly shorter cooking times. This trick made poor cuts taste like quality and stretched limited protein into satisfying meals. Making buttermilk from scratch with a splash of vinegar and regular milk was one of the oldest substitutions in country baking. And it worked because the acid did exactly what real buttermilk does. It reacted with baking soda to produce the carbon dioxide that made biscuits rise and pancakes turn fluffy. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit for 5 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly, gave you something close enough that no one at the table could tell the difference. Before the 1920s, real buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning cream into butter, and every household that kept a cow had plenty. When families stopped churning, this trick kept the old recipes alive. You poured until the milk looked right, added the vinegar by feel, and moved on. It was just what you did when the recipe called for something you did not have and the nearest store was 20 miles of dirt road away. Ramps and eggs were spring's homecoming song in the hills. Ramps, those wild mountain onions with a kick sharp enough to make your eyes water, came up when winter loosened its grip. Folks foraged them along shady slopes, carrying bunches home like treasure. Fried in bacon grease, they turned golden and fragrant, and when you cracked eggs over them, the skillet became a celebration of survival. After months of salted meats and dried beans, this meal tasted alive again. The air filled with that pungent scent only mountain people could love. It was quick to make, rich in flavor, and a sure sign that better weather had arrived. Ramps and eggs reminded everyone that the land still provided if you knew where to look. That first bite after the thaw was like breathing again, spicy, hearty, and filled with gratitude for another season of life in the Appalachian hills. Crackling cornbread with cane syrup was Christmas-side that elevated simple cornbread into something rich and celebratory. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat left from lard making, were mixed into cornbread batter before baking, creating pockets of crunchy, porky richness throughout. The bread baked in cast iron until crusty outside and tender inside, its top golden and inviting. Served with dark cane syrup drizzled over warm slices, this combined savory and sweet in ways that defined mountain eating. In rural communities, crackling cornbread meant using every part of the hog, transforming scraps into celebration. The cracklings added protein and flavor that plain cornbread lacked, while cane syrup provided sweetness families couldn't always afford. This was Christmas abundance created from what others might discard, proving mountain cooks knew how to make luxury from nothing. Making gravy from pan drippings was the technique that turned every meat dish into 2 meals and wasted nothing in kitchens where every calorie counted towards survival. After frying or roasting meat, the browned bits and rendered fat left in the pan became foundation for rich gravies that stretched protein into something more filling. Flour was sprinkled directly into hot fat and stirred constantly until it formed a paste that cooked to golden brown, developing deep, nutty flavors. Milk, water, or broth was added slowly while stirring to prevent lumps, creating smooth gravy that captured every bit of flavor from the original meat. Children learned to make gravy by standing beside mothers at the stove, learning exact motions and timing that defined good cooking. The gravy was poured over biscuits, potatoes, and cornbread, making small amounts of meat feed large families. Nothing was scraped into garbage when this knowledge lived in households. Keeping a slice of bread in the brown sugar jar was one of those small kitchen tricks that sounded like nonsense until you tried it. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating on each crystal loses moisture to the air, and the crystals fuse together into a brick you cannot scoop. A slice of plain white bread tucked into the jar released just enough moisture to keep the molasses soft without making anything wet. You replaced the bread every week or so when it went stale, which meant it had done its job. Some families used a damp cloth instead, and others swore by marshmallows, but the bread trick was the cheapest and the most reliable. Nobody explained the science. You just saw your mother drop a heel of bread in the sugar, and 20 years later, you were doing the same thing in your own kitchen without thinking about it. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Salt-cured country ham was Christmas luxury taking months to create and symbolizing prosperity through patience. These weren't store hams, but whole hog legs cured in salt, then hung in smokehouses through fall and winter. The curing began in November. with fresh hams rubbed with salt and sometimes sugar, drawing out moisture and preserving meat without refrigeration. By Christmas, hams developed deep mahogany exteriors and concentrated salty sweet flavor, unlike anything modern. The ham was soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then baked slowly with brown sugar glaze, creating caramelized crust. Sliced thin, the meat was intensely flavorful, salty, smoky, rich, requiring only biscuits and red-eye gravy. In Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, country ham represented wealth and foresight, since families began curing in fall for Christmas. The smell of ham baking filled houses Christmas morning. This wasn't bought but made food, requiring knowledge of salt ratios and smoking. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds before brewing was something the old folks did without explaining why, and if you asked, they just said it tasted better. They were right. The sodium blocks bitter compounds on your tongue, smoothing out the harshness of cheap, over-roasted beans, the only kind most rural families could afford. A quarter teaspoon in the grounds before the water hit was all it took. Alton Brown brought this trick to television decades later and acted like it was a discovery, but women in Appalachian kitchens had been doing it since the early 1900s with the rough ground coffee they bought in bulk from the general store. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You just watched your grandmother add that tiny pinch without measuring, and you tasted the difference in the first cup. The coffee came out rounder, smoother, less like something you had to choke down. Nobody writes it on the bag. You either grew up knowing or you did not. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story. Make do and make it delicious. Whole hog shoulder with crackling bread was Christmas feast requiring community effort, turning December butchering into celebration. Mountain families raised hogs specifically for Christmas slaughter, feeding them all year. The shoulder was large enough to feed extended family, fatty enough to stay moist during long cooking. It was seasoned with salt and pepper, then slow roasted over hickory coals in outdoor pits men tended throughout Christmas Eve night. Fat rendered slowly, creating crispy bark outside while inside stayed tender. Women saved cracklings, crispy rendered pork fat bits, to mix into cornbread batter. The crackling bread baked in cast iron skillets, top golden and crunchy. In rural Georgia, Arkansas, and Mississippi, this meant Christmas smelling like wood smoke for miles. Families gathered around outdoor fires, sharing whiskey and stories while meat cooked through cold night. The finished shoulder pulled apart easily, juice running into crackling bread. Burying potatoes in ash was one of the oldest cooking methods mountain families used before electric ovens existed in rural Appalachian communities. Fresh potatoes were nestled directly into warm ashes at the edge of a fireplace, covered completely until only coals surrounded them on all sides. The ash acted as insulation, slowly roasting potatoes over several hours until skins turned papery and insides became fluffy and sweet. Families learned exactly how deep to bury them through years of practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The technique required no pots, no pans, and no fuel beyond what was already heating the home. Children were sent to check potatoes by poking them with sticks, learning doneness through texture rather than timers. The finished potatoes emerged with subtle smokiness no modern oven could replicate. This method fed families through winters when other cooking options were limited and fuel was precious. If saving grease was the first rule of those kitchens, preheating the cast iron skillet before pouring cornbread batter was the second, and breaking it meant soggy, pale bread that embarrassed whoever made it. You set the skillet in the oven while it heated, dropped a tablespoon of bacon grease into the hot pan, swirled it until the sides were coated, and poured in the batter fast. That searing contact between cold batter and screaming hot iron created the golden crust that crackled when you broke a piece off. The crust that separated real cornbread from the sweet, cakey version people in the mountains refused to eat. Appalachian cornbread had 3 rules: all cornmeal, buttermilk, and absolutely no sugar, and the hot skillet was the 4th. You learned it by hearing that hard sizzle when the batter hit the grease, and knowing the bread was going to be right. Cornbread and milk supper was what families ate when the pantry was nearly bare. A leftover wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, covered with cold milk or tangy buttermilk, became dinner without complaint. It was cool and soft, with just enough salt and sweetness to feel like comfort. Hill folk did not see this as poor eating. They saw it as good sense. Every crumb mattered. Every drop of milk earned its keep. On hot summer nights, this meal kept folks full without firing up the stove again. It carried the quiet rhythm of old kitchens, simple, clean, and made from what you had. Some would drizzle a little molasses over top or sprinkle sugar if they had extra. Kids slurped it down, while elders remembered the hard times that taught them gratitude. Cornbread and milk supper was proof that even in scarcity, there was dignity, taste, and the kind of peace that only home-cooked food could bring. Fried squirrel with milk gravy turned small game into Christmas celebration, tasting like hickory nuts and mountain tradition. December, squirrels were fat from fall acorns, their meat firm and flavorful. Young boys went hunting Christmas Eve morning, fathers teaching them to shoot cleanly. The squirrels were cleaned, cut into pieces, then soaked overnight in salt water. On Christmas morning, they were dredged in seasoned flour and fried in hot lard until golden crispy. Pan drippings became milk gravy, flour stirred into hot fat, then milk added slowly until thickened creamy. Families served this over fresh-baked biscuits. In Appalachian communities, Squirrel Christmas meant teaching children to hunt, to provide. Understanding food came from work. The meat was tender and slightly nutty, each piece representing hours in cold December woods. Mothers fried batch after batch, keeping platters warm. This wasn't poverty food, but tradition connecting tables to land itself. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the butter crock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Those kitchen tricks kept daily cooking smooth, but some of the old methods reached back centuries, to a time when survival depended on knowing what to do with dried corn and a pile of wood ash. Making lye from hardwood ash to turn corn into hominy was one of the oldest cooking techniques in North America, learned from the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples long before anyone called it nixtamalization. You packed clean ash into a wooden hopper, poured water through it, and collected the alkaline liquid that dripped out the bottom. Dried corn soaked in that lye water for a day or two until the hulls loosened and slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process unlocked niacin that the body cannot absorb from untreated corn. Without it, families who lived on corn developed pellagra. The old cooks did not know the word. They knew that treated corn kept people well and untreated corn did not, and they passed the method along without ever needing a laboratory to prove what their hands already understood. Soup bone and potato hash was what happened when thrift met hunger. After a long week, that old soup bone still had work to do. It went back into the pot for one more boil, drawing out every ounce of flavor left in it. Then you would toss in diced potatoes, onions, maybe a carrot if you were lucky, and fry it all together until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with promise, even when there was not much else to eat. Mountain cooking was about stretching what you had until it could not stretch anymore. This hash tasted smoky, salty, and satisfying. Nothing fancy, just real food made by real hands. Families knew that wasting even a scrap was a sin against hard work. Soup bone and potato hash proved that resourcefulness could taste every bit as good as abundance when cooked with patience and pride. Fried rabbit sausage with buttermilk biscuits was Christmas breakfast that turned wild game into something special enough for holiday morning. Mountain families ground rabbit meat with pork fat, sage, black pepper, and salt, forming patties that fried crispy in cast iron. The sausage was lean from rabbit but rich from pork fat, creating perfect balance. Served alongside buttermilk biscuits, split and buttered, this was breakfast that required hunting skill and butchering knowledge. In Appalachian communities, Christmas morning meant rabbit sausage sizzling while biscuits baked, filling houses with savory smells. Children woke to this aroma, understanding Christmas began with food earned through work. The sausage was tender inside with crackling crust outside, its sage flavor marking it as celebration food. This represented mountain Christmas, wild game transformed into tradition, poverty turned into pride through skill and resourcefulness. Frying apples on string lines was the preservation method that turned autumn abundance into winter sustenance without any special equipment or expensive supplies. Apple slices were threaded onto long strings using needles, then hung from rafters, porches, or any warm, dry spot where air could circulate freely around each piece. The process took days or weeks depending on humidity, with families checking constantly for signs of mold or insect damage. Properly dried apples shriveled into leathery rings that could be stored in cloth bags for months without spoiling. Come winter, these dried slices were rehydrated in water or cider and cooked into pies, cobblers, and fried pies that tasted of concentrated sweetness. Children helped with threading, learning patience and satisfaction of preparing for harder times. The strings became decorative as well as practical, hanging in kitchens where their sweet smell mixed with wood smoke. Using potato water as a base for bread dough and soups was a trick born from the simple refusal to waste anything, and the science behind it turned out to be remarkable. That starchy, cloudy liquid left over from boiling potatoes activated yeast faster than plain water, giving homemade bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life. Pour it into a soup pot, and it thickened the broth naturally without needing a roux or a handful of flour stirred in at the end. Depression-era families figured this out by necessity. When you could barely afford the potatoes, you certainly were not pouring their cooking liquid down the drain. Grandmothers kept a pot on the back of the stove for exactly this purpose, ladling the water into jars to cool and use later. Bread made with potato water rose higher and stayed soft a full day longer, and the soups it went into had body and richness that people could not explain but could always taste. The water looked like nothing. It cooked like everything. Fried cabbage and onions was the meal that turned scraps into a feast. You started with whatever you had: a small head of cabbage, a tired onion, and the last spoonful of bacon grease from breakfast. Toss it all into a cast iron skillet and let it fry until the edges browned and the smell filled the house. There was no recipe written down, just instinct and a good ear for the sound of sizzling vegetables. This dinner showed what made hillfolk cooking special: the ability to turn nothing into something worth sitting down for. It was hearty, smoky, and comforting, the kind of dish that could hush an empty stomach and still leave leftovers for breakfast. Paired with a hunk of cornbread or a slice of salt pork, it reminded everyone that flavor did not come from money. It came from patience. Sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that made life feel rich. Persimmon pudding with hard sauce was Christmas dessert that captured wild sweetness of mountain autumn. Persimmons had to be gathered after first frost when they became soft and intensely sweet, their astringency gone. The fruit was pressed through sieves to create smooth pulp mixed with flour, eggs, milk, spices, and molasses. Baked slowly, the pudding emerged dark and dense, its texture somewhere between cake and custard. Hard sauce, butter and sugar beaten until fluffy, flavored with vanilla or whiskey, melted over warm pudding, creating rich contrast. In mountain communities, persimmon pudding represented patience and knowledge, knowing when persimmons were ready, understanding how to preserve their flavor. The pudding was deeply spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, its persimmon sweetness unlike anything else. This was Christmas dessert that couldn't be rushed or bought, requiring understanding of seasons and willingness to wait for nature's timing. Storing eggs in water glass was the preservation method that kept mountain families supplied through winter months when hens stopped laying entirely and eggs became scarce. Water glass, a solution of sodium silicate and water, sealed eggshells by filling their tiny pores and preventing air and bacteria from entering. Fresh eggs were carefully lowered into crocks filled with the solution, where they remained edible for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. Families gathered eggs during peak laying season and preserved dozens at a time, ensuring protein through lean months. The technique required clean eggs with intact shells, so women handled each one carefully, rejecting any with cracks that might introduce contamination. Eggs preserved this way cooked normally, though they sometimes produced flatter whites, which mattered little when food security was the priority. The crocks were stored in cool cellars where temperatures stayed stable. Saving bacon grease in a jar by the stove was the single most useful habit in any country kitchen, and the women who did it never thought of it as a trick. It was just how you cooked. Every morning after breakfast, the grease went through a small strainer into a tin can or mason jar that sat right next to the burners, warm and ready. That jar replaced butter for frying eggs, greasing cornbread pans, starting a roux, and softening vegetables before they hit the pot. During the Second World War, the government ran campaigns asking families to turn in their drippings. Rendered fat was used to manufacture glycerin for explosives. But in mountain kitchens, nobody needed a campaign. They had been saving every drop since before anyone could remember, because throwing away good grease was the same as throwing away money. Most kitchens today do not even own a grease jar. The trick did not disappear because it stopped working. Beans and taters were what kept mountain families going when there was little else to count on, the kind of meal that stretched far and satisfied deep. Pinto beans simmered low and long, softening with salt, fatback, or even just water when meat was short. Meanwhile, potatoes waited nearby, boiled, mashed, or fried crisp to turn a pot of beans into a full supper. Together, they made a plate that felt heavier than hunger and warmer than hardship. The beans brought body, the potatoes brought comfort, and the combination brought peace after long days. Mountain folks never needed fancy seasonings or sides. They just needed food that filled and soothed. Children knew the smell of beans simmering before they even came through the door. It was the smell of stability, of knowing you would eat, even in hard years. Beans and taters taught patience, gratitude, and the quiet pride that comes from surviving together. It was more than supper. It was a ritual that reminded families what mattered. Every forkful told the same story. Work hard, share what you have, and be thankful for enough. It was food for living, not showing off, and no one ever left hungry. Stack cake with dried apple filling was Christmas dessert requiring community cooperation and weeks of preparation. This wasn't ordinary cake, but thin layers stacked with dried apple filling, creating towering centerpiece feeding dozens. Women began drying apples in late summer, slicing thin and laying on screens until leathery. Come Christmas, apples were rehydrated and cooked with molasses and cinnamon until thick. The cake layers were simple: flour, lard, molasses, spices, rolled thin and baked separately. Assembly was ceremony, each layer placed and spread with apple mixture. The cake sat for days, letting flavors meld into something slicing clean and tasting like autumn. In mountain communities, stack cake represented cooperation because neighbors often brought layers to celebrations. The finished cake stood tall, dark layers visible through golden apple filling. This represented mountain Christmas, patient, cooperative, deeply satisfying. This was a Hillbilly weeknight supper in 1972. A dented aluminum Dutch oven on the back burner, a skillet of cornbread in the oven, a pot of soup beans that had been simmering since sunrise. $14 of groceries a week from the company store. 20 minutes, start to finish. By 1985, that kitchen looked different. The Dutch oven was in a yard sale. The pintos had been replaced by a can of Dinty Moore stew. The cornbread was a Marie Callender frozen side. The stove had a microwave bolted over it, and the 20-minute window was filled by a 4-minute ding instead of a whistle. That is what replaced this food. Not something better, something faster that called itself better. You can put this food back on your table tonight. A pound of pintos, a hunk of fatback, a pan of cornbread. 20 minutes, eat it at the table. Share in the comments which of these your grandmother made for you and whether number 16, the cathead biscuit, reminds you of a morning nobody talks about anymore.